Uh, Thank you for all for joining this special meeting today, hosted by Department of Computational Medicine and Bioinformatics, the Department of Mathematics, Michigan Institute for Data Science, and the Smale Institute. Please keep yourself muted and feel free to use the chat for any questions. On behalf of the University of Michigan, I would like to welcome Professor Lenore Blum and Professor Manuel Blum. Professor Lenore Blum got her PhD from MIT and has filled many distinguished positions, including as a distinguished professor of computer science at Carnegie Mellon. Professor Lenore Blum's seminal work includes the Blum-Shub-Smale machine, a theoretical model of computation over the real numbers. She has done tremendous work on increasing the participation of girls and women in STEM fields. Professor Manuel Blum also got his PhD from MIT and was the Bruce Nelson Professor of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. He's one of the founders of complexity theory, a Turing Award winner, and has mentored many notable computer scientists, 800 descendants. Their son, Professor Erwin Blum, is also a computer scientist and is a professor and chief academic officer at the Toyota Technological Institute in Chicago. Today, Professor Lenore Blum and Professor Manuel Blum will talk about their joint work with a presentation titled A Theoretical Computer Science Perspective on Consciousness. Please join me in welcoming them to the University of Michigan.
Thanks so much, Indika, for the introduction and for inviting us and arranging this. Okay, the way it's going to go is I'm going to talk first, and then Manuel will do a multimedia presentation, and we're willing to stay on after two for discussion if people would like that. Okay, so let me go ahead now. Whoops. Okay, so we're interested in what can theoretical computer science contribute to the discussion of consciousness. And here are the three authors. There's Manuel Blum, who's had a long-term interest in the brain, Avram Blum, who is an expert in machine learning, and myself, I've been interested in non-standard models of computation. This photo was taken a while back, as you can see, at Carnegie Mellon. So what do I mean by consciousness? Well, roughly speaking, consciousness or conscious awareness is everything you pay attention to, awake or dreaming, but not dreamless sleep. It's what you see, hear, feel, smell, taste, your joys, fears, sorrows, and pains, and most especially your own inner private speech, which gives you a sense of self. Until about 30 years ago, the scientific study of consciousness was taboo. And then in 1988, Bernard Bars presented his work on a cognitive theory of consciousness, presenting what's called the global workspace theory. And in the 90s, with the advent of fMRI technology, neuroscientists were able to look into the brain non-invasively and start to see what was going on when people were having conscious experiences. In '95, Francis Crick wrote The Astonishing Hypothesis, where he talks about neural correlates of consciousness. There have been various approaches to the study of consciousness over the millennia, the original going back philosophically, probably religion too. We have Buddha, Confucius, and Plato. And actually what I found kind of interesting when I looked a little history, that these folks were just 100 years apart, mostly 100, 150 years apart in total. And this is all over the world. And this is what we see, things happening simultaneously, ideas coming up. Today, there are many, many philosophers working on consciousness, and I only mentioned two. Here we have Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers. And the reason I talk about them here is that they sort of represent the two ends of the spectrum of the philosophical approaches. Daniel Dennett is what we might call a functionalist, and Chalmers is a phenomenologicalist. And then, of course, we have the psychological approach, sort of going back to James and Freud of the last century, and more recently neural correlates coming with Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, who looked at neural oscillations and spikes. And then we have measures of consciousness, Juliet Canoni and Koch talking about integrative information theory. They gave axioms, and some measure phi, which somehow intuitively measures the amount of feedback in a system. I'm getting feedback right now. And then there's the approach, as I mentioned, from cognitive neuroscience, the global workspace approach with Bernard Bars and Alan Baddeley. And that approach actually goes back, and it's inspired by work on cognition that happened at Carnegie Mellon in the 60s, starting in the 60s with Alan Newell, Herb Simon, Raj Reddy, and John Anderson, who take a kind of architectural approach, a global workspace approach to cognition. So that inspired Bars. And inspired by Bars, we get the global neuronal workspace approach, which is neural correlates, but looking at from a global workspace approach of Dehane, Shenzhou, and at Michigan, George Mashur. The Blums, we're coming from a theoretical computer science perspective, and theoretical computer science is a branch of mathematics concerned with understanding the underlying principles of computation and complexity, specifically the implications of resource limitations. And why I have some of these in red is that these are all have some affinity, that we have similar kindred spirits here for the global workspace, the global neuronal workspace, and the approach that we're taking. And obviously, I'm not doing justice to the many other approaches to consciousness, but these are the ones I'm looking at now. So what can theoretical computer science contribute to the discussion of consciousness? Well, we too want to understand consciousness. We want to give a simple mathematical model to help us get this understanding. For example, we want to give a good definition of chunk. And in 1950, the psychologist George Miller talked about the magic number, 7 plus or minus 2. And what he was thinking about is the amount of information that we can contain at any one time in our short-term memory in our head. And that could be a word, it could be a digit, maybe it's a poem where we know the first phrase, and that leads us to the second phrase and the third phrase and so forth, and we can spew out a whole poem. So what we would like to do is to give a formal definition of the informal notion of chunk. We also want to distinguish between simulating and experiencing. We want properties of consciousness to be emergent, not programmed in. And we are not looking at a model of the brain, nor of learning or cognition. We are looking for a model of consciousness. And of course, we will have to think about learning and cognition later on, but at the moment we're just focusing on consciousness. And we are looking for simplicity, not complexity. And we want to provide a blueprint for building a conscious-like machine. And this is currently under construction by our colleague, Jean-Louis Villacroze. In 1995, the philosopher David Chalmers poses the easy and hard problems of consciousness. What he says is the easy problems of consciousness are those that seem directly susceptible to the standard methods of cognitive science, whereby a phenomenon is explained in terms of computational or neural mechanisms. And this is sort of known as functional or access consciousness. But the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experiencing. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there is a subjective aspect. And this is called maybe phenomenal consciousness. And I think this has posed a dialectic for a lot of the thinking and consciousness since 95. We'll talk about this in a moment. But usually this hard problem is associated with the word qualia, the feeling of what it is like, the feeling of what it is like to be a bat. And many focus on what it feels like when you see red. And depending on where I show this picture, where in the world and your culture and your background, you may feel or feel different things when you see red. Okay. Here is our formulation of the easy and hard problems. We say, for us, the easy problem is to make a robot that simulates feeling, for example, of pain and joy. And the hard problem is to make a robot that truly experiences feelings of pain and joy. And here you have Sophia. She's simulating a lot of emotions, and she ends up with the expression of pure pleasure and joy, right? And although Sophia's expressions may simulate pleasure, she has what we call acute anhedonia. And philosophers might say she is a zombie. And in humans, anhedonia is the reduced ability to experience pleasure. It's often caused by damage to the nucleus accumbens. And Kent Berridge and Morton Kringelbach have really looked at pleasure and have shown that pleasure really consists of the dynamic ensemble or the cycle of wanting, liking, and learning. And this is really, it gives a new perspective on pleasure, which possibly in the past, in terms of experiments, was looked at more like the wanting part and the addictive part of pleasure. But anyway, I believe that we need to take these components into account if our conscious AI is going to experience pleasure. So that's some of the neuroscience that we're looking at. You can also see on the web demos of robots experiencing pain. And this particular robot is in such excruciating pain that it's excruciating to watch. And but nevertheless, he has pain asymptolia. Manuel will talk a little bit about this later. Okay, so our view of consciousness is that consciousness is a property of all properly organized computing systems, whether made of flesh and blood or metal and silicon. Our thesis is that it is the architecture of these systems, some key processes that are able to communicate thoughts, plans, images, sensations, and expressive inner language, and the dynamics of prediction, feedback, and learning that makes them conscious. And our architecture is based on the global workspace, and some of the key processors that we think are important for consciousness are the inner speech, inner sensation, and model of the world that communicate, again, in an expressive multimodal inner language. We also feel that one has to have some motivation, desire, and energy, and some minimal cognitive ability. But our model will explain the brain at a very high level of abstraction, at levels well above that of neurons and neuronal activity. And so we're going to give a formal definition of a machine for consciousness, which we call the conscious Turing machine or conscious AI. That might be more appropriate. And then we'll define consciousness in the model, then point out properties of consciousness in the model. And we were inspired by Turing's simple yet powerful model of a computer that helps give understanding of computation. And here we have a 23-state universal Turing machine that can compute anything one can compute in the cloud or a supercomputer, but you can get your head around a Turing machine, not the cloud. You can prove theorems about the Turing machine. And thus, inspired by Turing, we are aiming for simplicity, not complexity. Our architecture formalizes the theater model or the global workspace model of cognitive neuroscientist Bernard Bars. And Bars describes conscious awareness through a theater analogy. Consciousness, Bars says, is the activity of actors in a play performing on a stage of working or short-term memory. The inner speech actor is often on stage. Their performance is under observation by a huge audience of unconscious processors in long-term memory that are sitting in the dark. Now, these are very intelligent long-term memory processors, as you must be. If you're sitting in the dark, you're my audience. Here's an example that's perhaps happened to you once or twice. You're at a party and you see somebody that you know, but for the life of you, you can't remember her name, okay? Then you go home and maybe a half hour later when it doesn't help, her name pops up. So what's going on? Well, maybe one of your long-term memory processors is recalling where you first met, maybe in a computer science class, and that gets broadcast down to the audience of long-term memory processors, and another remembers something about what she does. Oh, she's interested in consciousness, that gets broadcast down. And then another processor says her name begins with T, and that gets broadcast down. And a half later, her name, Tina, comes up to the stage from the audience of unconscious long-term memory processors who's been thinking, searching. The stage, the self, the conscious self on stage, doesn't know how or where her name was found. It's not privy to the workings of the unconscious self. And here's an example that's known to mathematicians, and it's happened perhaps to you a couple of times. Henri Poincaré tells a story where he's been working day and night trying to crack a hard problem. He can't get anywhere. And luckily, a friend of his asks him to go on a trip with him to exploration somewhere. And so as he says that, what happened is, he says, as I was about to board the bus, the idea came to me without any of my former thoughts seeming to have paved the way for it. The transformations I had used to define the Fuchsian functions were identical to those of non-Euclidean geometry. So what was going on is that there are two areas of mathematics that he knew quite well, and he had never seen or consciously seen the connections between these two, and all of a sudden he sees these that it's they're isomorphic to each other. That pops up into his consciousness. And so what was happening is these long-term memory processors are working furiously, primed also by his working day and night as well. And then, of course, this conclusion comes up to short-term memory. Okay, so here's Bernard Barr's model of consciousness. And in the center, he has working storage, that's his stage. And down below here, he has many, many long-term memory processors. And these are powerful processors for autobiographical memory, linguistics, visual knowledge, and so forth. That's his audience. And on the left, he has inputs from the outside world coming in through sensors, and that's going into working storage. On the right, we have an output going from working storage out to through actuators to affect the outside world. And on top here, we have a central executive who might be like the stage manager. So this is Barr's picture of his model of his global workspace model. Okay, so let's see what the conscious Turing machine structure looks like. So we start with a tiny short-term memory. This is a read-write memory. This is our consciousness. It's small. That's our stage. And on stage, an actor can hold one chunk of information. Now, this is not the 7 plus or minus 2 chunks, the magic number of George Miller, which in fact I think is a red herring. In fact, that number is arbitrary, and probably it's affected by the size of the chunk and the computation limits of computation time. We'll get into that in a minute. We also have an audience of an enormous number of long-term memory processors. Each of these are parallel processors. They're very powerful. At the beginning, they're not connected with each other, but there are many of them. We might say they're about 10 to the 7th, we imagine, of these processors. There are 10 to the 7th cortical columns in the brain. We also call this audience our sleeping experts. We have no central executive in our model. As we only wanted one chunk in short-term memory, for simplicity, we can get away with that. We can actually get away with the central executive because its functions emerge from our conscious Turing machine dynamics. So if we don't need it, we're not going to put it in. We have a very, very simple down tree in our model. So the root is in short-term memory, and then there's a leaf in each of the processors. We have an up tree, which is a binary tree. It should have one leaf in each of the processors, and then it's going up to the short-term memory. And we'll talk about the dynamics in a moment. We have an input map from the external world to various processors coming in through various sensors here. We have like an eye or an ear. And the input map will translate a worldish into the internal language brainish of our conscious Turing machine. So brainish is the inner language used by processors in the conscious Turing machine to communicate with each other. It's a multimodal language used to express inner speech, inner vision, inner sensation, expressed in words and phrases called gist, which is richer and more expressive than outer languages. And we believe that having an expressive inner language is an important component of the feeling of consciousness. We also have maps from special processors to actuators that will affect the outside world. These maps also translate brainish into worldish. And you might notice here that our input maps and our output maps are going directly to and from the long-term memory processors. They're not going through short-term memory as in Barr's model, again, for simplicity, and this works very well for us also to do this. Okay, so that's another simplification that we've made here. So let me tell you about the uptree competition. Now, these long-term memory processors want to get their information on stage. They want to ask their question like, what's her name? They want to get answers and so forth. So the way they do this is they each put a chunk into the competition. So I have to tell you what a chunk is. So chunk PT is the chunk that processor P puts into competition at time T. And it consists of a six-tuple. And the six-tuple consists of the address of P. So if there are 10 to the 7th processors, that is by the 10-digit number, the time that is putting the chunk into the competition, the weight. So the gist is that small amount of information that the processor wants to get into short-term memory. And this is in brainish, a multimodal language. And since it's multimodal, it has maybe some information about vision, about words, about music, several multimodals in the gist. And that's one of the reasons we don't need many chunks. That one gist will have a lot of information, though it has to be small and succinct. There is a way that the processor gives its gist. This is valence, so it's positive or negative, and it sort of has to do with the importance that the processor is giving to that gist. And then there are two other parameters, which we call intensity, absolute value of the weight, and mood weight. And they're in red here because as the chunk goes through the competition, if it keeps on moving up, its address, time, gist, and weight will stay constant, but its intensity and weight and its intensity and mood will keep on changing. So the intensity, which is the absolute value of the weight, just at the beginning, and the mood, which is the weight at the beginning, will be changing as it goes up. So let me give you an example of the competition here. So first of all, I'm only giving you two of the parameters of this tuple, two parts of it. I'm giving you an indication of the gist, and I'm giving you an indication of the mood. And let's see what's happening here. And this particular competition is very simple. But what we use in general, we don't use this one, but we use something that's almost as simple as this. But here we have pain that's got up to this particular height, and it has its mood at this point is -5, and it's competing with joy, who has a mood of +3. And our rule for this case is the largest absolute value of the mood. So pain wins out, and the new mood will be the sum of the two moods. So -5 + 3 is -2, which sort of makes sense that if we have pain and then some joy, the pain might diminish a little bit. And now let's look at the next juncture here, where pain will be competing with fear. And pain has a mood of -2 and fear has a mood of -5. Fear wins out, but now the new mood is the sum is just -7, and that also makes sense a little bit because when you have fear and some pain, the fear might even be more exaggerated. Okay, so if we're thinking that it takes like 10 milliseconds to go up each level in the competition and do the computation, then if we have 10 to the 7th processors, and with this binary tree, it'll take maybe about 220 is my estimate of the milliseconds to get up to a short-term memory, which actually is consistent with what we know now about unconscious decisions getting into consciousness, about 220 milliseconds up here. Okay. And I just want to mention that the competition algorithm has two parts. We have to compute the local winner, and we have to compute the properties of chunks go to the next level. And no matter what we're choosing here, it has to be very quick so that we can do those computations very quickly. Yeah, so I want to mention that if anybody's there doing some calculations or little examples, you might notice with a very simple example that this very bad property of what I've just shown you, that if I take the processes and move them around to different locations, do a permutation, I could get a very different outcome here of going into short-term memory, which probably isn't too good. So what we do is we go to a probabilistic model, and our probabilistic model, then we're going to essentially do coin tosses at each node. In fact, what we've built in at each computation node here, where we're going to make a decision, we put in what we call a coin flip neuron. And the coin flip neuron takes two non-negative numbers, A and B, and it will compute the probability of A to be A over A plus B, and the probability of B is opposite. So for example, the A and B here will be the value of the function I'm making a decision on. In this case, it's the absolute value of the mood. So in the first case, the pain is going to go up with a probability of 5 So the absolute value of 5 minus 5 is 5 over absolute value of that 5 plus 3, and that will be 8. And the probability of joy will go up 3 And so this will give us a very nice property, which we'll see in a moment. But just to give you an example, I have a deterministic computation tree on the left, and I have 4 processors with just A, B, C, and D, and I'm making a decision based on intensity. We can see that D has a higher intensity, but if we go through this process on the deterministic computation, A will win. On the other hand, if we look at the probabilistic computation tree, and if we look at what happens to the gist with D in it, which has intensity 4, it'll go up one level with a probability of 4/5, and then that will raise at the next level with a probability of 5 over 11s. And so the total probability of it going to the top will be 4/11s for the D gist. And the A gist will be 3/11s, and even the gist C, which has intensity 1, will have some probability of getting into short-term memory. So this works really nicely. So we have a little theorem here that says if F is an additive computation function, so the function we're using is intensity, then for all processors P and time T, the probability that P wins the competition, in other words, its chunk gets into short-term memory, that the game at T will be F of chunk P T0. In this case, it's the initial intensity over the sum of the intensities. And one student asked us, well, why don't we just get rid of the computation tree and just have this at the top? And you can answer that by looking at the complexity of computation, why we need to go step by step. Okay, and so for a corollary, we have if F is any additive computation function, chunks get into short-term memory in proportion to their importance with respect to the F value and probability. And so we have independence of submitting processor location, which is nice for us now. So once a chunk gets into short-term memory, it's then mapped immediately broadcast by the downtree, a very fast broadcast to all the long-term memory processors. And realistically, not all the processors are interested in the information, but for simplicity, we have all of them receiving the information. Okay, and I'll just make another comment. If that process takes, let's say, 10 milliseconds, then the whole thing going from the processor is putting something into the competition and something getting into short-term memory and then broadcast down. That whole process takes maybe 220 milliseconds for us to become conscious of what's going on. So there's a dynamic here really of prediction, feedback, and learning. And prediction comes in several ways. When chunks are put into this process of the uptree competition, that's kind of a prediction. When it's sending a signal to the output, that's kind of a prediction. When it may be talking to other processors, as we'll see it can, that's kind of a prediction. And then we have some processes called model of the world, which themselves are making predictions. Okay, and then we get feedback, and feedback is coming from this broadcast. What, you know, her name was Tina, or something like that. That's the broadcast. We're getting some feedback of what we thought. So that's where feedback's coming in. Feedback's coming also from the external world. It's also coming from other processors. So there's kind of feedback going on. And in our model, we have learning happening in all the processors. And here we utilize Avram Blum's sleeping experts algorithm, which what the sleeping experts algorithm does is, for example, to the query, what's her name, perhaps some processor said, I think it starts with S, and that process is very bold and put a lot of weight to it. That got into short-term memory. But later on, the processor found out her name was really Tina. And so at that point, so that process was maybe too bold. The sleeping experts algorithm will lower the weights that that processor gives to its gist in the chunk. On the other hand, some processor might have originally said, her name is Tina, but it was a kind of a meek or a sort of a humble, timid processor and gave very low weight, and it didn't cut into short-term memory until it saw later on that it was correct. That sleeping experts algorithm will raise the weights that processor, or raise the intensity that processor gives to its gist in its chunk. So these sleeping experts algorithm is at the moment our major learning algorithm in the CTM. So let me go through the whole dynamics here. We have input coming in from the external world to several processors. Then we have some processor putting in a chunk into, well, they're all putting in chunks into the competition, but one processor's chunk wins. The fear processor's chunk wins with fear going up to short-term memory. And that's broadcast down through the broadcast to all through the down tree to all the long-term memory processors. And then one processor here, in this case, inner speech, reacts to what it's just got, information it's just gotten. Now notice the inner speech processor actually reacted to the fear processor's chunk that went into short-term memory and came down. And when this happens, processor A will link to processor B when it sees that B has answered A's call. It will be a bidirectional link. So long-term processor A will link to up with B when B answers A's call. And this is sort of the Hebbian notion of neurons that fire together, wire together. But more importantly for us is that linking enables conscious processing to become unconscious. So after a while, it's not going to have to, the sphere's chunk is not going to have to go through short-term memory for inner speech to start screaming. This will happen unconsciously, and there'll be a number of links, or the links will get stronger even over time. So this is the final part of our connections in the CTM. Starting out, the processors, we may need to build in a few links, but we're starting with nothing and then quickly putting links come in dynamically. So I've now given you the sketch, the cartoon sketch of our model. And we can formalize it as a 7-tuple without a reference to this picture at all, as an STM, LTM, downtree, uptree links, input, output, and coincidentally, the Turing machine is often given as a 7-tuple. We've defined chunk formally in this model. We have something we call predictive dynamics, which, as I was indicating, deals with prediction, feedback, and learning. And we have some special processors. We're focusing on a few right now. We may add others that we think are really important for consciousness: model of world, inner speech. So now that we have the model, we can define consciousness in the model. And we say that the chunk in short-term memory is the conscious content of CTM. And we say consciousness in the CTM is awareness, or the reception by all long-term memory processors of the conscious content of CTM. So conscious awareness happens at the broadcast. When that chunk is broadcast, the conscious content is broadcast, then we become aware. And there's a constant activity of chunks competing to get into STM. So at every clock tick, these chunks are being put in and going up and then broadcast to the LTM. And these broadcasts and continual broadcasts creates what we're calling, by definition, the stream of consciousness. Okay, so these are just definitions. They don't are telling us anything about consciousness, a feeling of consciousness in our machine. So we see that the reasonable of our definitions of consciousness will lie in the number of concepts that the model will explain easily and naturally. And I'm going to give you, to end, three things. Okay, the first is blind sight. In blind sight here, this man, Tien, is asked to go to the other room, and he's sitting there on the sofa in a room that's totally cluttered. It's like an obstacle course. And he says, but I can't see. He then gets up, walks to the door, avoiding obstacles. What's going on? So let's give a very, very high level explanation in the CTM. So we have that the vision processor is a collection of processors, really. And that collection is getting input from the external world, maybe from the eye, maybe from other processors that heard that go to the other room. And then the vision processor, or at least part of it's working properly, and it sends a message to the walk actuator, and then the guy gets up and walks to the other room. But the connection from part of the vision, the one part that goes to STM, the short-term memory, is broken. So without the vision processor having access to short-term memory, he has no conscious sense that he can see. So very high level explanation of blind sight. Now let's look at inattentional blindness. So here's a very well-known film. The viewers of this film were asked to count how many times white-shirted players pass the ball. So they're given a basketball, and the white-shirted players, well, they're all passing the ball, but the white-shirted players, so they have to do the count. And people watching the film actually do a pretty good job. I think it's 11 or 13. I can't remember exactly. But they're asked at the end, but did you see the gorilla? And here's the gorilla here. And most people, if they haven't seen this film before, do not see the gorilla. So what's going on? So what's happening is when we're asked, we are given a task to look for, we're giving higher weights to the task and lower weights to that we shouldn't be looking at. So the higher weights are given to white-shirted things, which are going up in short-term memory, and that's how we're counting. And we're giving very low weights to the black-shirted guys there, and that's not getting into short-term memory. So we really not conscious of the gorilla. It's gotten such low weight. Okay, and here's a third example, change blindness, and here's whodunit film, and this detective comes into a room and this guy is dead and he has to do his detecting. So he says, clearly somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe. Each of you tell me your whereabouts. And then the maid said, I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom. And the butler says, I was buttering his lordship's scones. And Lady Smythe says, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed. And the detective says, Constable, arrest that Lady Smythe. And she says, but how did you know? And then he says, Madam, any horticulture will tell you one does not plant petunias until May. Okay, solve this mystery. Except there's a bigger mystery for us. Here's the picture of the room we saw at the beginning, and here's the room at the end, and look at all the differences. The detective's coat has obviously changed. These flowers on the left have obviously changed, and even more so, this guy who's dead changed his clothes, and his knee is up in the air, and there are a zillion other changes here. So if you go through, it's interesting to see all the changes. So what's going on? Why didn't we see the many changes? Well, for one, the filmmaker was very clever and didn't show us flickers between one scene and another. He went from the major scene, then went to that scene I showed you of the maid and the butler, as was another scene that was totally different and each step separate. But even more so, there is the same gist that explains both scenes. On the left and the right, this is the gist. The scene is a living room of a mansion with butler, maid, and detective, and a man laid out on the floor. We're sort of, that's what we're bringing to consciousness, no more. So they look the same. So here quickly, to summarize that, in the blind sight, what's happening, the connection from the vision processor to short-term memory is somewhat broken, so we don't have consciousness that we can see, even though other parts are working fine. Inattentional blindness has to do that we've given high weights to what we're looking for, to white shirts, low weights to what we're not looking for, black shirts, and the other explanation, high-level explanation for change blindness is that we have the same gist for the first picture and the last picture. So you can find our paper. It's published in the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness. It's online, so if you just Google for it. Our appendix, there's a new stuff in the appendix on our archived paper. And I want to end, I hope I'm giving Manuel enough time. I know he's sort of their pins and needles. But I do want to mention that I want to thank George Massour, who sent me a copy of his paper when he found out about this, called Conscious Processing and the Global Neuronal Workspace Hypothesis. And so they're looking at the correlates, neuronal correlates of consciousness. But what I see here, which is really kind of neat, is correlates between our model and the global neuronal workspace model that they're looking at. And the theater that we're looking at is transformed into a theater of the round with a global workspace there. And they talk about conscious content as we do global broadcast, conscious awareness, stream of consciousness. They have a word ignition, which we don't use, but I think it's very similar to what we call our predictive dynamics, which has a lot of feedback in it, hi-fi. We don't look so much at levels of consciousness as in anesthesia, but we do look a little bit at disordered sleep and dreamless sleep, like we have lo-fi. So thank you now, and Manuel will discuss the feeling of consciousness. Okay, Manuel, it's yours.
Oh, good. It's worked. I'd love to see the people, but I'm going to try not to do that right now so that I can see what's going on here. Okay, so thank you. This is part 2, what gives rise to the feeling of consciousness, the easy and hard problem, the LTM processors needed and those not needed for consciousness.
Thanks, Lenore. Consciousness in the CTM is defined as awareness of the contents of short-term memory by long-term memory. In the CTM, all hard work is done by the processors, all of which operate unconsciously in LTM. Assuming CTM is a good model for human consciousness, we are conscious of only the gist that is sent from STM to LTM, no more, no less. What is that gist of which you are conscious? It is always one of 5 things. An inner voice articulating your thoughts can be one of them. An inner image, perhaps when you imagine a dream, a map, or a dream image. And sensation and inner feelings and so on. Although consciousness in the CTM is defined to be awareness of the content of short-term memory, that definition leaves open the question, what gives rise to the feeling of consciousness? Our answer, all LTM processors know what's in STM. So if any processor is responsible for consciousness, that processor knows what's going on in STM. Some LTM processors are particularly responsible for consciousness. These include an inner speech processor that translates all speech in STM brainish, the language of the brain, into an inner speech akin to what the ear hears from the external world. An inner vision processor that translates all images in STM brainish into sketches akin to what the mind's eye sees in dreams. And this third is especially important. Both inner and outer sensations are broadcast from STM. All that the conscious Turing machine is conscious of in the real world and in dreams are gists from STM. This means that the gists that produce the outer images of the world are the same as those that produce the inner images, for example, dreams. Now for our big question. Will the CTM have the feeling that it is conscious? Yes or no? We believe that yes, but how do we prove that a CTM feels conscious? We don't. The reasonableness of our definition of consciousness lies entirely in the explanation it gives for consciousness, the extent to which those explanations agree with our intuitive feelings about our own consciousness, the range of concepts that the CTM explains easily and naturally, and the CTM's response to situations unforeseen by CTM's creator. Here are some concepts explained by the CTM. Why is short-term memory so tiny? First, it ensures that all LTM processors pay attention to the same conscious thought. Otherwise, if STM contained the gist from many processors, it would be unlikely for them all to focus on the same thought. How is a math proof understood? When you have fully understood a math proof, you feel that you have its entirety in your hand. What you actually have is a gist, the idea of the proof, with pointers to its definitions and lemmas. How do LTM processors decide what signs to give their weights? In an infant, hunger and pain are negative, food and love are positive, the infant's signs are built in. Later in life, if sign is not obvious, sign is taken to be that of the current mood. How are the feelings of pain and pleasure to be explained? We are not talking about the knowledge of pain and pleasure, we are talking about the feelings of pain and pleasure. Just because pain is negative and pleasure is positive does not imply CTM will feel pain and pleasure. So what does make CTM feel pain and pleasure? This brings us to the easy and hard problems. The easy problem is to make a robot that simulates feelings, like those of pain and joy. The hard problem is to make a robot that truly experiences those feelings. But first, let's distinguish between simulation and experience. In the disorder called pain asymbolia, the patient knows she has pain but does not suffer. Adults who get pain asymbolia from a concussion know what pain is, claim they still have pain, but say it's okay. These people can have a root canal without anesthesia. They know they're in pain, but it's okay. They claim that their pain is still present, but that it doesn't bother them anymore. The robots we build are pain asymbolic. We know how to make robots appear to be in pain, but we don't know how to make robots feel the pain. We have 4 suggestions for explaining the experience of extreme pain. Only 4. First, broadcast. Extreme pain is an actor that takes over the entire stage. It prevents all other actors from reaching the stage. Pain messages, and only pain messages, are broadcast. Every processor knows of the pain. In extreme cases, nothing else can enter STM. There's confirmation for this. Under conditions that normally cause agony, pain asymbolics can think while normals cannot. From education.
I'm going to interrupt this for a minute. Hope you can hear me. This has explained extreme pain. I want to explain moderate pain. Extreme pain makes it so that none of the processors can get into STM. Moderate pain still allows other processors to get into STM, but it gives them a shorter less time in STM. More time is taken up by the pain itself. So let's see. Continuing.
Psychology review. The impact of persistent pain on working memory and learning by Smith and Ayers. Participants that identified as experiencing low levels of pain for 6 or more months performed significantly worse than pain-free participants on a variety of tests. However, while broadcasts account for some pain, they do not account for the sudden excruciating pain at the moment you tear a ligament. What does? Interrupts. Sudden extreme pain, a finger touching a burning stove, interrupts all unconscious processors. Interrupts, as opposed to broadcasts, cause processors to instantly put their work on a stack, forces them to pay their maximum immediate attention to the cause of the interrupt. This differs from broadcasts, which send their information to processors without forcing them to put what they're doing on a stack. And then there's screams of pain in Brainish, which is a much richer language than simple vocal English. Brainish, they not only hear, but you see and you feel. Interestingly, a powerful vocal scream can interfere with the screams of pain in Brainish generated by an LTM processor.
I'll interfere again. I want to make a point that I had this opportunity to go to a dentist to have a couple of fillings made, and so I asked to not have any painkillers, and the pain really was terrible. And then I started to scream just to myself, not out loud. And it's wonderful how screaming in your mind can help lower the pain. The reason I'm mentioning this and the reason I asked the dentist not to give me painkillers is because I've felt that if I really understood pain, I would either be able to stop pain altogether or at least know why I can't. And so I can now tell you, I do not yet really fully understand pain.
Vicious cycles, but I won't go into that. Questions. Which LTM processors are not needed for consciousness? Which are needed for consciousness? The answers will help us understand consciousness better. It's very interesting that most LTM processors are not needed for consciousness. And you can go through them. For example, vision and hearing processors. Helen Keller lost both vision and hearing, but was nevertheless conscious. Some people have prosopagnosia, face blindness. They are conscious. SM had its calcified amygdala and as a consequence felt no fear, none, zip, but she was conscious. Phineas Gage lost his prefrontal cortex when a pipe went through his skull. It changed his personality, but he was conscious, and so on. Here's, in fact, a picture of Phineas Gage with the picture of his skull there.
I'll stop this for a moment also to mention that after this pipe had gone through, Phineas did manage to keep on working, and he, towards the end of his life in Chile, he would drive a 6-horse stagecoach from Valparaiso up to Santiago, and one day, and then the next day he'd drive it back down. This is a non-trivial task. Able to do quite a bit without that frontal cortex. A few other things here. There's a picture of Helen Keller, is that small one in the middle. At the lower left is HM, Henry Molaison, who had an operation to remove his hippocampus. And because of that operation, he could no longer make new memories. At least he could not make any new declarative memories. But he could make procedural memories. So one of the wonderful things is they would ask HM to, they put a typewriter there, ask him to copy something with a typewriter. He'd say, but I don't know how to type. Try. And so he'd try and he'd be amazed. He'd say, oh, I guess I do know how to type. See, he had learned how to do it, but he didn't remember that he had learned. In the lower middle here, you can see a skull without a cerebellum as opposed to a normal skull with a cerebellum. People that are born without a cerebellum are clumsy in their life, but they can still get through it. They're clumsy in the sense that, for example, they don't learn to walk until they're about 7, but they can work and they can continue. In the upper right is Kim Peek, who played by Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man. And there's a picture of Kim Peek's brain, his brain versus a normal brain on the lower right. He was a very strange person. And then there's my stroke of insight, which I'll get to.
Which LTM processors are needed for consciousness? You believe just 3 are needed. The first is a model of the world processor for distinguishing yourself from what is not yourself. The second is an inner dialogue processor for planning, forecasting, and so on. It might be in English, but for a dog, it could be doggish. A broad, general, minimal ability to think, including motivation, which we consider to be energy and drive. What happens to your consciousness if you lose processors for model of the world and inner dialogue? Jill Bolte Taylor is a neuroscientist who lost both when she had a stroke. She says that when you lose that model of the world, you can't distinguish yourself from the rest of the world, and the world is beautiful. She lost her inner dialogue processor. It was very difficult for her to plan, to do things, but she needed to get some help. Fortunately, she understood that. She had the broad general ability to think and the motivation, the energy and drive to do it. So she was able eventually to write this wonderful book. You know George Gallup's mirror test for self-awareness? It captures the 3 requirements for consciousness. Here's an elephant that sees a mark on its forehead in the mirror. It has a model of the world for distinguishing self from not self. When it sees the mark in the mirror, it tries to remove that mark, not from the elephant in the mirror, but from its own forehead. It has this inner dialogue for planning, because to remove that mark, it has to get that trunk up there to remove it, something it has not done before. It has the ability to think, including the motivation and energy to do it. So yes, an elephant can pass the mirror test for self-awareness. Other animals too. A chimpanzee can pass that test. About fish, there's a fish that you can buy for your saltwater aquarium called the cleaner wrasse fish. Small, beautiful fish. When it sees a mark on its chin, it will go off, try to rub it off, and then goes back to the mirror to check if it succeeded.
I'm going to stop it again because of the cleaner wrasse fish, which I love. This fish, when it sees a mirror for the first time, tries to fight it. At some point, it stops and just looks. And then it gets the idea. You see it flying up the water in the aquarium and then down in the aquarium. I don't know if you can see me, okay. And then all the while looking at itself to see if the fish in the mirror is doing the same thing. And then you see the cleaner wrasse turning upside down and watching itself. Yes, the fish in the mirror is doing the same thing. This is something you never see a cleaner wrasse do. And so it gets the idea that, yes, that's itself. And then when it sees this mark, which you can put on its chin, it will go off, try to rub it off, and then go back to the mirror to check if it succeeded. Okay, I love this fish.
There's a genus of ant called Myrmica, 3 species. All 3 have eyes, all 3 pass the test. You paint red paint on their plate on their forehead, and when it sees it, it tries to remove it and then checks in the mirror again to see if it succeeded. So yes, there's some wonderful animals that do pass it. And that's the end. Thank you.
I just want to mention that I mentioned that chimpanzees pass the mirror test, but it turns out that gorillas, do you think gorillas pass the mirror test? Yes or no? Turns out gorillas do not pass the mirror test. Why? Well, a gorilla cannot look itself in the face. When a gorilla sees another gorilla, it's a call to fight for war. So the gorilla sees this other gorilla in the mirror and then goes and smashes the mirror. So it's an imperfect test for consciousness. Okay, so.
How about stopping sharing so we can see you?
Yes. Stopping sharing. Stop sharing. So you couldn't see me when I was doing what the cleaner RAS does, going up.
We could, but smaller.
Smaller. Okay, that's okay. It's a small fish.
Okay. Yeah, well, I want to make a couple of comments about the extended conscious Turing machine. So we're envisioning also the conscious Turing machine to be able to make use of Google and Siri and AlphaGo and the model of the world. So it's not just limited to the processors that we construct for it, but it can make use of everything as we do. Also, we're using Google all the time. We're using Wikipedia all the time. So just wanted to say that we do have a notion of extended Turing machine. Right, so I think that, in fact, our conscious Turing machine is not a Turing machine at all, because it's not the input-output map that matters. It's really the architecture and the dynamics that is creating this consciousness. So, you could simulate this with something else that doesn't have the same kind of internal structure, and it won't have the same features, we believe. So it really isn't a Turing machine. It's almost like we're paying homage to Turing there. So I think we really ought to call it a conscious AI or give it another name. And in fact, those processors down there are certainly not Turing machines. If anything, they're RAMs or other that operate in different ways. So it's more like a homage than, and I see.
And there are some questions here.
Right, Yuri has a question. You have your hand up and you didn't write something. So how about?
If I speak, do you hear me?
I hear you. Yeah, good to see you. Haven't seen you in a long time no see, as they say in Chinese.
So
I found.
When distributed algorithms appear in computer science,
yeah,
all the processes work on the same abstraction level. Now, you mentioned that one of the processors said, oh, maybe the name starts from S. And another said, oh, I remember it's teeny, but I don't have enough intensity, don't have power. So it looks like they're all small homunculus living on the same level, which is not the case. So in reality, they probably have very different levels of abstraction. Now, the bottom line, where they all understand each other, is probably chemistry. So when they talk, it's probably well below the level of your architecture. That's the end of the question.
Yeah, so the language, we are assuming that there's this multimodal language called Brainish that they all understand. They all have their own internal languages. All these things have their own internal, but to communicate with each other, they're doing this in Brainish, which may be the number of spikes or whatever. I don't know how that would be in the brain, and we're not talking about that really. And right now, there's a lot of multimodal processing in AI where, for example, you're putting vision together with words and all that. Right now, we haven't seen any real language that is expressively multimodal. And so that has an area to really work on. So they will be using the same language. And it could be, maybe done in spikes or different ways, and we're not quite sure on that.
Lenore, we have a bunch of questions. You want to read one of them, or shall I read it?
Sure.
So let's go on to Samuel, to everyone. My question is, if we have mapped the entirety of the neuronal system of the C. elegans, though still have no clear or direct empirical relations between neuronal activity and behavior, then how can we expect computational simulations of neuronal cognitive behavior to reflect true consciousness? Wouldn't it be like with the C. elegans in that we would simulate the fundamental properties of a system, say the brain, but then not have a direct empirical relation between the computationally simulated consciousness and behavior? I think this is why it's called the hard problem. Yes, I think you are absolutely right. I believe you could have a complete description of the brain, everything in the brain, you could make it, and you would still not understand what makes for pain, what consciousness is about. So one of the purposes of having a very simple model is to try and get a hold of that. And we think that this architecture, or an architecture like this, will enable us to understand.
I also want to point out, if you're not familiar with neuroscience, it's very hard to read some of these other papers. So the one that George sent me is a great paper, but if you don't know what PFC is and all these other concepts and things going on, it's hard to understand. And what I think is very nice about our model, it helps one go back to the neuroscience. You can hang different concepts on different aspects of our model, which is quite simple, if that's what you want to do to understand what's going on in the brain. We're trying to do almost the opposite, though. We're trying to sort of get some concepts that seem to be so fundamental that they actually would be in anything that we would imagine is conscious, or at least if something is built with these properties, it would have something that we would call conscious. So that's what really we're trying to go in this opposite direction of sort of abstracting key components of what appears to be necessary for consciousness.
I'd like to go into this question from Anthony DiGiovanni. I'm surprised that distinguishing self from non-self is listed as required for consciousness. Is this consistent with the reports of advanced meditators? So I don't want to get into the business of meditation, but I do want to say that the distinguishing self from non-self was something that we really thought about and decided was very important for consciousness. It's really, Jill Bolte Taylor really shows that it is in her book, and that we're very pleased that after we thought it was important, we discovered that the mirror test actually captures that. So that's, you have anything to add, Lenore? Or should I go on to the next question?
Well, there is a little paradox here, because I don't meditate, but I know some people say that when they get into a state of meditation, they feel at one with the world. And so that seems like, and they feel like that's the ultimate state of consciousness. So that's maybe the paradox here. And somehow that's suggesting to me that when you get into that state, you're really doing something that happened to Jill Bolte Taylor. That's part of the brain mechanisms are being very suppressed. But I don't know that. But that could be a kind of ironic or a sort of paradoxical concept. This version of one with the world.
Want to read some of these questions?
You're really doing a nice job, Manuel. Or if maybe some people want to ask questions.
Well, I can read them better. Let me read. Stilian Atanasov Stoev. Does consciousness matter? Is it only useful in the context of multiple CTMs interacting in an environment? Is consciousness key to defining communication or organization? Yeah, so I want to explain why this is very important. If you have 10 to the 7th processors to work on a problem, you don't know which processor has the information you want. Sometimes I'm looking for some information on my iPhone and I don't know, did I put it in the calendar? Did I put it in the notes? Is it in a letter? There are a dozen places you can try to go to get that information. And the nice thing about the CTM model is you can ask the question, like, what's her name? And every processor can try to look for it. So yes, I think that that's very important. Okay, I hope that helps to answer. And then Vijay Gautam Subramanian, any pitfalls to this model? Any alternatives?
Before you go ahead, there's this other thing about consciousness. It really, particularly when you do predictions, it sort of allows you to maneuver in the world, to do predictions of what's going to happen if you move next, and so forth, when you're doing this inner planning. So I think it's critical for evolution. It's critical for survival. It's I think that's another aspect of it. But go ahead, Manuel.
Yeah, so that's explaining why the model of the world is
Well, yeah.
a very important processor. But I think this was asking whether you need this. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Vijay Gautam Subramanian, any pitfalls to this model? Any alternatives that have similar explanatory powers? So I'm going to answer it like this. I've been looking for a model since I was a kid, a good model. When I went to college, I finally learned about finite automata, and I thought to myself, wow, that's it. That's a good model for consciousness. But in fact, it didn't give me any insight. It didn't work. When I got to Turing machines, oh, that'll be the model, and that didn't work either. It's part of what got us to realize that this model that Bars came up with is actually terrific. It answers all the questions of what I was looking for in a model.
Okay, I'd like to answer that. There are competing models, and I suggested one approach is coming from integrative information theory. And in fact, there's a big debate now whether integration IIT or global neuronal workspace, which is the one, and Templeton Foundation has supported both of them to fight it out. So there is a big debate there, but there's also people like Penrose who think that there are quantum effects going on, which we don't agree with. So with the Tononi IIT, we do believe that there are measures. And so we see that these theories are complementary. Having a measure of consciousness and having a model for consciousness don't seem to be against each other. They're sort of complementary. So that's how I view that. There's also the view that comes from Dennett and his folks, Frankish, that consciousness is an illusion. In fact, there's nothing, not that consciousness isn't real, but the reality of consciousness is coming from just our perception of how we're putting things together. It's sort of like when you look out and you see a scene and you see this whole thing, you think, but you're only seeing as much as like the tip of your thumb, and your saccades are putting these pieces together and you have a sense of the whole. So the illusionists say there's no difference between phenomenal consciousness and functional consciousness. It's the illusion that you're getting that's giving you the phenomenal consciousness. So there are different perspectives. I think ours is a little bit closer to this illusionist, that we're sort of seeing that all of these pieces put together are giving you the sense of consciousness.
Lenore, there's a question here from Randall Frank, which asks, are the effects of aging easy to incorporate into the CTM model? The perception that as we age, things like recall tend to slow down. That's a wonderful question. And one of the things about the model, we didn't talk about time. Time begins at time t equals 0. There are ticks, 1, 2, 3, and that there is an end to time. We use capital T for the end of life. And that's all part of the model. So this kind of question should be answerable in the model. By the way, having a finite lifetime is very much against what most theoretical computer science does with its models. But it seems like the appropriate thing to have here.
Indika has a question.
Oh, no. Yeah, I have a question, but I think somebody wrote, Stephen wrote that here. Do you see any relationship between consciousness and the immune system? Both the brain and the immune system are able to accept external stimuli, react to them, and adapt their environments. I'm curious what your thoughts are on any similarities or differences between these systems. We are studying in my lab on the immune system. It's another analog for how to study learning and memory. This is a very powerful, like the immune system built for surprises, right? Taking care of me all the time. So I'm wondering too, Lenore, how you think about Manuel.
Off the top of my head, I think what I say won't be very insightful. What I can say is at the moment, as I said at the beginning, we're just looking at consciousness. And we will have to bring in things like learning, cognition, and other things into the model. I think that's true. But right now, we're sort of starting at the base. And does it have implications? That would be very interesting. I don't know. I can't say that. I'd have to think about that. There's so many things to think about here. Yeah, but thanks for bringing that up. What we're trying to do is look at some examples, like the three I gave had to do with maybe kind of vision or perception. And if we can easily give explanations for some things that people are giving, big neuroscience explanations for, but we can show it like in these processes. You can, at least for the CTM, we can explain blind sight. At least in the CTM, we can explain inattentive vision and all these other concepts. I think that's a start for us. I think we're going well ahead, though. Of course, it looks like that's the way you could fund it. We're going to look at aging for Alzheimer's. Our model can explain that, and the immune system for COVID and all of that. I don't think we want to go that far yet. Except Manuel might.
Another question over here.
Yeah.
From Kevin Compton. Does your model allow you to define free will or shed any light on the claim many biologists make that free will is an illusion?
Yeah, well, Manuel, you thought about this a lot, but this illusion part is very much like Frankish and Dennett's view of consciousness as an illusion. Not that it doesn't exist, but you can give a functional answer to it. And Manuel, you thought about free will a lot.
Yeah, so in our paper that we do have an explanation for free will that's that of course I love, that which says basically you are conscious of just what is in STM. What goes on in the processors, you don't know what's going on. And because of that, the sense that you have when you, of how you come up with ideas, the sense of that, I'm getting lost in my words, sorry.
Well, it's sort of a computational time. I mean, it has a lot to do with time, that within the time frame that you have, you're free to make any decision you like, but you have to make a decision at some point, and then that's
yeah, good.
So I think the time is delimiting the free will.
So in our paper we explained it. And thank you, Lenore. That helps. In the case of chess, you know that at any moment in time when you're playing chess, you may be up against having to make a move, and you don't know whether to move this piece or to move that piece. And in some cases, it's a very difficult decision. And you know that winning depends on the result of that. And so you will use your time to try to figure out which of the two moves is better. And while you are trying to make that decision, the thinking that you do while you're trying to make that decision, you have free will. You are able to choose whichever move you compute to be the better one. And so our sense of free will is that it's what you feel during that time that you're doing the computation before you have made up your mind which choice to take.
So somebody has asked about empathy, and I think that's great because I think, when people ask us, in particular Manuel, why is he interested in pain? This is fraught with a lot of, heavy things. Why are you going to build a robot that feels pain? Well, one reason is it's going to have to take care of itself and not be, not understand pain, but it also can help give empathy. So a number of these feelings are probably important for giving this entity or giving us empathy, that we have a similar kind of feelings of pain and so forth. So yeah, I think empathy is going to be a very important component, and we should be talking about how that's coming in to our model. So somebody's asking about infants, and there's a lot of work on infants. Our friend at Berkeley, you know her name, Manuel, who works a lot with children, with infants.
Right. It's
so these are tip of the tongue. These are things going out. But since I see Kent Barrage here, I'd like to take advantage, and you don't have to answer or not. But as Manuel's been interested in pain, I've been interested in pleasure, actually. So we've sort of divided that up, that work. And so I read your papers because I was very interested in that you've sort of done this similar thing that Bars has done, is isolating components of things. So you've isolated these components of pleasure and really debunking these old theories that there's this pleasure center, and if you keep probing it, you'll just keep probing it, and it's really kind of addiction. But anyway, I also think that there's a kind of homeostasis, that a system is looking for balance, and that looking for balance, just that activity.
Alison Gopnik.
Alison Gopnik, yeah, okay, that's the person. Yeah, Manuel put that in. Yeah.
No, Francine Dollins.
Okay, she's a friend of mine, but I forgot her name. Okay.
She's the one that can answer the question about consciousness in infants.
Yeah, Alison can. Yeah, but I'm asking Ken. So the question is, and so we're getting as infants positive feedback from, getting milk when we're crying. And so that's reinforcing, the kind of wanting, liking, the cycle. So we're getting more reinforcements and we're not generally, unless there's a very bad situation, we're not generally getting reinforcements for pain. We're really getting more reinforcements for pleasure. So it seems to me that the homeostasis of getting a balance, or more the search for pleasure, the search for balance might be pleasurable. Just that dynamic of the search for balance. And I don't know if there's a comment on that.
Stephen Kent Berridge, hi. I didn't know what you look like. Now I do. It's great. There is this question from Stephen Lindsley.
Oh, yeah.
At what point would you say that this work is complete? In other words, what criteria would have to be met for you to personally say, yes, we have created a conscious system? I think that is a terrific question, a very important one, and one that I have worried about, and I do not have an answer. But anybody that has an answer for that, wow, I would like that. I see Stephen Lindsley, there's a picture of him there. Hi, thank you for that question.
So there are people who say there will be things similar to Turing tests that one could do to test consciousness in a.
Yeah, but we don't have such a test. In fact, even the mirror test, it's very easy to build a robot to pass the mirror test. That's not a problem. So we just don't have a good test for consciousness.
Well, there are starting to be some really interesting things. So we believe very much that, and as Manuel showed you with this the mirror test, that animals are conscious and at different levels. So we strongly believe that. And a lot of people say, I mean, even Dennett, who I would imagine would think that animals are conscious, he says he only thinks that it's a property of humans, and that because even though he loves his dog can't talk. So I think that's a very specious argument. And in fact, there's a really new paper that just came out from the National Academy of Sciences, which is looking at rhesus monkeys and consciousness, similar consciousness in rhesus monkeys and humans. Rather than doing tasks that require verbal response, they're looking at tasks that may have to do with vision, where the human responds differently to conscious priming, to unconscious priming, and these rhesus monkeys seem to do the same thing. responds similarly to conscious priming and unconscious priming. And I think we're starting to get tests there to look at consciousness in animals. Those kind of tests may be appropriate for looking at our CTM and asking if it's, seeing if it's conscious.
That's a good point, Lenore. And in fact, the pointer to this interesting work on rhesus monkeys and human consciousness is in this week's Science.
Yeah, and it's also here up on the chat. So Francine put it up here. I had told her about it, and she put the article name up here. But it's called Disentangling Perceptual Awareness from Non-Conscious Processing in Rhesus Monkeys.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
So I see.
Thank you, Indika.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you, Indika.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you.